Juliet. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Miles, and my colleague is Phil, who you've just met. We're going to be hosting and talking to you for the next hour about this fascinating subject. First of all, just thank you, Juliet, for the introduction, and thank you, Vitality, for inviting us to come and be part of this today. It's much appreciated. We're both directors and founders of a business called People Academy, as Juliet rightly said, and we spend a lot of our professional life talking about and thinking about emotional intelligence. So with the time that we've got, we need to dive quickly into the subject, if we may. So we're going to kick off straight away with that. It's a subject that people often debate about. What's it really about? What does it mean? What does emotional intelligence mean for me? Am I emotionally intelligent or am I not emotionally intelligent? Well, it isn't as simple as that, because it's not a case of saying I am or I'm not. It's slightly more complex than that, which we'll try and explain to you during the next hour. We look at it in four ways, I guess, and Juliet's already alluded to this. The first thing is to be able to identify your own emotions. Do you spend time thinking about or identifying your own emotions and how you process your own emotions? The second thing is, do you recognize the emotions of others, or do they just make you react in a certain way? Thirdly, we talk about regulating your own emotions. So in other words, do your emotions control how you behave, or do you control your emotions? And finally, managing the emotions of others. Do you believe that you have the right to or the ability to help manage the emotions of other people as well? We use the phrase using emotions intelligently, and that's part of what we're going to talk to you about this afternoon, I guess, which means that if you use those emotions intelligently, then you're going to take the right course of action, I guess. So we're going to talk about lots of things here between now and 2 o'clock, but I'm going to hand to Phil to start us off to talk about something called the people dimension and to build on what I've just said. Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Miles. Yeah, I agree. It's not quite as simple as it appears on the surface, but I think something that is a pet hate of mine is talking about high emotional intelligence, and it suggests that there's a superiority there, and low emotional intelligence is the opposite. And I think we've got to get over that. Unfortunately, we are going to use the terms low and high, but please understand, high doesn't mean necessarily all good. There's always a downside, and low doesn't mean all bad. Far from it. So it's about understanding where you are, and we'll come on to that in some detail. The people dimension, right. I mean, this is supported by Harvard, because they've come up with a similar set of characteristics of how to manage yourself, both in terms of your behavior, but also your emotional intelligence, and how to develop it. And it's simply this, it's moving forward your self-awareness, understanding yourself, how you behave, how you impact on others, and also your own emotions and how those come out and how those impact on other people. Understanding other people, we call it people acuity. So it's awareness of others, awareness of how they see you as well as them, and recognizing the differences, not least in the way they are emotional and how they handle their emotions. The third thing is agility, which is to enable effective engagement with people. It's thinking about what others need from you and how you may adapt in a small way, but important way to get effective engagement with other people. And the fourth thing is self-management, because we've all got something in there in terms of emotional intelligence that is not helpful to us a lot of the time, or some of the time. And it's being aware of that and having the wherewithal or the tactics to be able to manage that effectively. And believe me, we can all do that. Miles?
Thank you, Phil. Juliet, could I get you to share the screen, please, if you would, which is we're going to share a screen with you now, which Phil and I are going to use as the basis of the conversation with you this afternoon. So hopefully in a second, you'll be able to see a coloured full wheel.
There we go.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Thank you for doing that. So this really is going to talk to the four things that I just mentioned at the start, which is identifying your own emotions, recognizing them, regulating them, and managing the emotions of others. And here's a way of looking at it. Here's a way of thinking about your own emotional intelligence. And that there's four factors, if you like, around this wheel: well-being, self-control, emotionality, and sociability. And within those four factors, there are a number of what we call facets. And Phil and I are going to speak to you this afternoon about what these facets mean and what having a high supply or a low supply of each individual facet might mean for you, maybe in a positive way or a less positive way. One of the things that we're going to ask you to do is, when we're walking around this wheel, and we're not necessarily going to do it all in the right order, is to think about where you are, to think about how you feel about this, to think about your experiences of yourself when we're talking about optimism or impulse control or empathy or emotional perception or assertiveness, etc. To think about you and to think about how you process those emotions, and to think about the impact that you have on others. We have used this as a starting point for the work that we do in emotional intelligence for a number of years now, in conjunction with Professor Petrides, who you can see at the bottom, who's I guess this is his life's work as well. So there's a lot of science and research behind what we're going to talk to you about this afternoon. So we're going to start off with well-being, which Phil's going to introduce you to, and we're going to talk you through the three facets of well-being, which are happiness, optimism, self-esteem. Phil.
Yeah, I think if I could just add, as we go through this, just focus on the one or two things that you think resonate with you particularly, that you might like to improve in some way. Because how not to approach this is to say, I need to work on these 13 facets. That's not helpful. It's not necessary. It doesn't work. So which are the one or two? So well-being. Okay. So there are three factors that make up this overall factor of well-being: happiness, optimism, and self-esteem. Happiness, self-explanatory, is primarily about how you feel about your world at present. Optimism is, do you view the future as a glass half empty or half full? And self-esteem is your overall impression of yourself or evaluation of yourself. You know, are you a world beater, or do you suffer from imposter syndrome, or anything in between? Miles?
Yeah, so whether you have a high or low supply of these particular three facets will determine the impact that you have on people and the way in which you engage with people. So, for example, a high well-being score, which might mean high happiness, optimism, self-esteem. I guess the positive things around that is that you will see the silver lining in things. As Phil said, you will be a glass half full person. You generally be an upbeat type character, and I would say generally satisfied with the way things that they are, because you're content about where you are now, and content about where you are going in the future. And that all sounds great, doesn't it? But actually having a really high supply of well-being isn't always good as well, because it might mean, for example, that you have an unrealistic view of something. You are so optimistic, you are so everything's going to be great, everything's rosy in the garden, that actually your view of the world, your view of a situation might be unrealistic. You might be self-satisfied. You may be just content and happy with the way that you are, which means that you're not likely to want to be developed, to take on other people's views, opinions of the world, etc., which can have a negative impact. And worst of all, very, very high well-being score can mean that you could be arrogant. You could think that you're right. You could think that your view of the world is the right view of the world. So having a high score can have good traits, if you like, and not so good traits. If you have a low well-being score, if your well-being score is kind of a low supply of that, that can be good as well, because it means that you are going to see challenges. You are going to see bumps in the road. You're not going to be so sort of swayed by these rose-tinted glasses that you have. You are going to see the problems in the road that are coming ahead. You are likely to take things seriously, and there is a need to get better and to develop. So that's a good side of having a low supply of well-being. And I guess the obvious sides for that well-being facet, I guess, is that you probably like to be quite pessimistic. Maybe you have a negative view of others. You know, if you've got low well-being, then the people that are high-fiving you and saying everything's great, you're going to look at them with disdain potentially. And certainly if you're in the business of managing, leading people, that could lead to being unsure of making decisions and unsure of decision making as well. So the point Phil and I are going to make through all of these is having high or having low supplies can have good things and bad things about it. So maybe, just maybe, there's a balance required with some of these things, which we'll come to a little bit later. I'll move on to self-control. Then I'll ask Phil to talk a little bit about sort of high and low supply of those. Self-control is a really interesting thing, and within that, there's three facets: emotional regulation, impulse control, and stress management. Now, emotional regulation is your ability to stay calm in situations that surprise you or upset you or just come at you without realizing. So when something happens that completely throws you off track or completely throws you off course, how good at you are keeping your emotions regulated, how good at you are staying in the moment in terms of what needs to be done. Impulse control is a measurement, if you like, of your impulses. So do you make rash decisions? Do you make quick decisions? Or are you someone that is the rabbit in the headlights and can never make a decision quickly and needs lots of information? Or are you someone that goes out for a loaf of bread on a Saturday morning and comes back with a new car because you can't control your impulses? Where are you on that spectrum? And stress management is, what's your ability like to not only recognize stress, but to do something about it? So Phil, do you want to talk about high and low supplies of self-control?
Yeah, okay, so with the emotional regulation, if you're out of control, I'm sure some of us experience this, probably a lot of us do it from time to time, but at low levels of emotional regulation, it pours out. You know, we're not in control of it. Everyone knows that we're feeling this emotion, whether it's anger or we're upset or whatever, and there appears to be no filter. At the other end of the spectrum, if you're very high on emotional regulation, you're very difficult to read. You're a closed book. You may not give the impression that you let people in or you're even approachable. You're on your own, and you're carrying those emotions on your own. So I think you can see how that can be unhelpful. Although the positive side of it is, if you have low emotional regulation, you're not going to bottle things up, and it's not going to get so tight that it could just blow at some point. You're able to filter them out, to actually allow them to come out. And if high levels of emotional regulation can be very useful in certain situations where, as Miles said, staying calm is really important. So as with all of this stuff, it is situational. Not every situation requires that, but it's important when in some situations and in order to control it. In terms of impulse control, it's a similar thing that low levels, people will appear passionate about things, quite rash. They'll let it all hang out. They say what they feel. There's no filter regardless of consequences. And then at high level, maybe too calm, too relaxed, too aloof, and may appear to be disengaged, lacking in passion. And in fact, they may, people with very high levels of impulse control may miss some significant opportunities. So somewhere in the middle is a good place to be. We'll talk about this more, but being in reach of both of those things is useful. But certainly awareness is the key, awareness of where you sit on that. And the third one, stress management. Again, it's all about self-control. So if you have low levels of stress management, you're going to show your anxiety, your agitation. Often you'll react by taking on too much rather than manage it, and it shows. And in fact, it can be infectious, as indeed all these things can, in terms of emotions coming out. Infectious, and other people start to worry. So if the boss is feeling particular emotions, maybe I should worry. If the boss is really angry and it's coming out, then should I be concerned? Should I be worried about me? So that's not helpful. At high levels, someone remains calm under increased pressure, but they can, pressure can be a very good thing for a lot of people. Helps them engage and move forward and get the job done. But if you're good at managing stress, you may be intolerant of other people who aren't. So there are upsides and downsides to all of this.
Phil, can I just jump in with a quick question?
Yeah.
Because this is also fascinating. And one thing that I'm thinking, and I think it came up in the pre-registered questions, is, as you say, it's situational, isn't it, as well? In some situations, high levels of self-control are more helpful than they are in other situations. Would you say that, in your experience, there are certain career paths or job roles where perhaps there is, do you know what I mean, at a different end of the spectrum suits that particular role better than others?
I think if you're an air traffic controller, I don't think it's going to be helpful to let your emotions pour out. It's noise. It becomes noise, and you've got to focus. You've got to make quick decisions. and you may not be feeling calm, but you've got to appear calm. So, I mean, that's one example. But then, so if you're managing a group of people, sorry, Miles, if you're leading people or managing people, there are probably going to be situations where you need to turn the gas up on self-control, possibly in an emergency, and focus. And there are going to be times when you need to show your humanity and show that you're a human being as well. You feel things, because it sort of gives other people the permission to be able to do the same thing. So you're showing some vulnerability. That's a good thing. And remember what I said, if you're very tight on emotional regulation, people can't read you. They don't know where they stand with you. They don't know whether, what, is there a problem? I don't know. So, you can have too much of it. Miles?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Phil, just to balance and sort of the other end of that spectrum, the stress management thing is interesting. To your question, Juliet, is we do a lot of work in the world of elite sport, and actually high levels of stress can actually sometimes be a good thing for an elite sports person, because it gives them the adrenaline to perform at the very highest level. So sometimes you don't want to be calm and chilled back. You need that energy, you need that aggression, you need that adrenaline firing through your body to create greater performance. So yeah, it's a great question, Juliet, that I think managing those things might depend on the situation you're in, but also the industry that you're in as well. So, but the point is, as we'll come to later, is understanding where you are against that, how you react to situations. Because one of the things about stress management, to build on what Phil has just said, is some people think they have it under control because they don't recognize it. They don't recognize it building up in them. They don't recognize it until it's too late, until it hits them. And that's also an interesting thing to think about as well.
I think overall, I'd say, wherever you sit on this, generally, that's not the place to be all the time. It's being able to flex it. And in order to do that, understand yourself, understand the situation that you're in, and recognize when it's important to flex it. That's overall, that's the key thing. Emotionality, I'll give you the definitions of it. So there are 4 in here. Empathy is, as I think most people would understand, is that how you see the world from other people's point of view. Can you put yourself in other people's shoes, and demonstrate that to them? Emotional perception, how sensitive you are to your own emotions and the emotions of others. Emotional expression, your fluency in expressing and communicating your emotions to others. Of course, quite often people, I think we all struggle from time to time in explaining our emotions and being able to be fluent in that. Some people are better than others. And then relationships it's how you build relationships with, I guess, people that matter. So people that are close to you, family, friends, people, colleagues, and so on. So how good are you at starting and maintaining those sorts of relationships, which is often about trust. Miles?
I think the emotionality factor is quite an interesting one, and I think it's the one that people tend to home in on when they think about emotional intelligence. They think because I'm good with people, I'm emotionally intelligent. It isn't quite as straightforward as that. So emotionality, as Phil's rightly said, is these 4 facets here. Empathy is a great example, because high empathy means exactly what you think it would mean. It would mean that you are very perceptive, that you're emotionally engaged with people, that you've got a good network around you, that you can spot when someone is trying to say something or flag something with you. But also high empathy can mean that you could potentially be a little bit sort of self-absorbed, or even make impaired decisions, because you're making decisions based on the person rather than what potentially might be the right thing to do be, which is something to watch out for. The other thing about having high empathy, because it's not all good, is that you may be seen as someone that's easy to influence. Now, that's an interesting thing to say, but if it means that you're listening to and taking on board and understanding and being empathetic about what everybody's saying to you, potentially you can be easily influenced by them. So that's something to watch out for. The emotional perception piece is, how well do you understand why you are thinking what you are thinking? How well do you understand why you are feeling what you are feeling, or do you just allow it to happen to you? And that's a really important one. And again, having a low supply of these things, there's some good things around there that you're going to make really good decisions, objective decisions, if you like. You potentially will be a tough cookie, so you won't be influenced by the people stuff. You potentially will make a very clear decision, and potentially will be independent minded as well, because you're not taking on all this noise around you that someone that's extremely high in empathy would do that. However, low empathy also means that you potentially may miss emotional signals. You may not spot someone around you who is trying to tell you something or is struggling. You may not spot that team member's behavior, that you may not have that empathy dial turned up, if you like, which can mean that you're emotionally distant and you don't invest enough in your people. You don't even invest enough in people. If people think you don't understand them, or you're not listening to them, or you're not taking notice of them, guess what? They start to take a step back from you. So you need to watch out for all of these high and these low factors, if you like. And just to add on what Phil said about the relationship piece, low supply relationship stuff normally means that in the work environment you are creating relationships to get the job done, not because the relationship is important to you, which is something to watch out for. High relationships, certainly in the work environment, would mean that the relationships come first and foremost before everything else. As Phil said, there's no right or wrong with this. It's that balance. It's been really interesting for us actually during the last 2 years that quite a lot of people's relationship supply has changed because of the pandemic, because of COVID. It's moved up and down because of what's going on, because they're not engaging with people every day, or some people have turned the dial up. They're making more effort now than when they were face to face with people. So it's just an interesting supply. Phil, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was. We're going to talk about someone from the archery world shortly, who's gone through an immense change. But empathy is an interesting one, because you would think, wouldn't you, that anyone involved in a career where they're working with and through people should have a high level of empathy. Well, the fact is that a lot of us don't have a high level of empathy, but including myself. It's in relatively short supply. But as a psychologist once said to me, Phil, if you haven't got a lot of it, use it wisely, which I think is really good advice. So it's knowing when, as Miles said, it's knowing when you need to dial it up or to draw on it. And the other thing to think about is this: would you imagine that in the nursing profession, everyone has extremely high levels of empathy? Because I think you'd be wrong, because it can you have empathy, that much empathy, that it ultimately gets in the way of you doing your job. You have to sort of regulate it and manage it, and of course some people struggle with that. So sociability.
Yeah, do you want me to sorry, Juliet, we're going to ask you a question then, sorry.
Oh no, I just think it's such an interesting point about empathy, and it came up again in the pre-registered questions, didn't it, around that sort of opposite end of the scale where you really have too much. Because I think that's as you said, Phil, it's common to have lower empathy, but there are quite a few people who struggle actually, don't they, with having too much. And to the point where they really feel the emotions of people around them, and that can be exhausting, can't it? Emotionally exhausting.
It can, and as a leader, as I said, Juliet, it impairs the decision making that you make sometimes as well. It also, as I said before, can mean that you are seen as someone that's easy to influence because you're so empathetic, which you need to be mindful of. So this idea of I've got lots of this isn't always good.
Yeah, I mean, I admire people that've got high empathy, naturally high empathy, because sometimes I wish I did that. I'm more selective, which is helpful in some ways and less helpful in others. As Miles said, there's no right or wrong. It's really just understanding. And as that advice to me was, use it wisely. If you haven't got a lot of it, I think is a really good point, and it applies to all of these things, really.
Yeah. I mean, I have relatively high empathy, and what that means for me sometimes is that I overthink how someone might be feeling. So I'll spot that they're maybe not happy today, or maybe they're a bit grumpy today, and then your mind can race away making stuff up.
It's usually me that's grumpy, by the way.
He's wondering what's bothering you, Phil.
but that's the thing as well. Being highly empathetic, you will make stuff up because you're thinking someone's thinking this, and you have to watch out for that. Watch out for that. Yeah. Sociability is the final factor, and I'll get Phil to talk about low and high supply in a second, but sociability is, again, a really interesting one. The first thing under there, as you can see, is something called emotional management. And this is really a nod to a couple of things. Is one, do you believe that you have the right to manage other people's emotions? And secondly, do you recognize other people's emotions? And so in other words, if someone comes to you having a particularly bad day or completely over the top and away with the fairies, do you feel you have the right or the ability to bring them back to a more balanced perspective, if you like? And emotional management is measuring that. We'll talk about relationships in a moment between these facets, but you know, empathy and emotional management have a direct link, which we'll perhaps come to towards the end. So that's the emotional management. Assertiveness is probably what you think it is. So it's how frank and forthright are you in terms of the way in which you communicate. And obviously, you know, high levels of assertiveness can be good and bad, and low levels of assertiveness can be good and bad, which Phil will talk about. And social awareness, which is the final facet under sociability, is how comfortable do you feel in environments where you don't know people or don't know processes or systems, etc. So, you know, how do you feel when you have to go to a dinner party where you don't know a single soul, or a networking event where you don't know a single soul? It's not measuring whether you can do it, it's measuring how you feel about that type of environment. Have we lost Phil? Is there?
Oh, have we lost him? I can't see either of you myself at the moment, but hopefully we'll get back.
Yeah, I'll carry on. So they're the three facets, if you like, and sociability. And emotional management is fascinating. And I say there's a link to empathy here, because you could have really high empathy, but you could have a low supply of emotional management, which means that the high empathy means that you'll spot that someone needs some support, or you'll spot that how someone is feeling. But the low emotional management means that you won't have a clue how to deal with it. Okay, right. You could have it the other way around. You could have very high empathy, which means that you're tuned into people all the time, but your emotional management is particularly low. Again, so you don't know what to do with it, or you don't spot it at all because your empathy is low, but your emotional management is high, which means that when it's brought to your attention or pushed under your nose, okay, you know what to do with it. So high supplies of sociability means that you are going to be socially confident, that your voice is going to be heard because you've got kind of that assertiveness about you, that you're going to be confident around others. The negative side of it, if you like, of that high supply of sociability would be that you may create dependency. Okay, if you've got a particularly, if you're particularly assertive, if you're particularly frank, if you're particularly forthright with people, believe it or not, you'll impair their ability to make decisions. They won't want to make decisions for fear of what you're going to say or getting it wrong. So you're having an impact on somebody. You may come over as manipulative. I'm sure none of us are manipulative, but high emotional management means that you feel you can manipulate how someone feels, which sounds a terrible thing to say, but it happens. And of course, the other thing about having a high supply, the downside of that is that socializing and the people thing just becomes everything, absolutely everything. Low supply of sociability means that you're more flexible, means that you're more accommodating, means that you're happy for others to lead. You're happy for others to lead. But the downside of that low supply means you might not be heard, you may avoid situations, you may not have a great support network. The assertiveness thing is interesting.
Yeah. Oh, sorry to interrupt you, Miles. We had a question come in. I think it might be a good time to ask it. Yeah. Somebody's asked.
By the way, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
That's great. We can hear you. So we were just talking about sociability, Phil, and the question come in live around the concept of, you know, introverts versus extroverts, and I wonder what you think about that. Is it likely that, say, it does sound like you're describing, Miles, you know, that an introvert might be lower on the scale of sociability naturally? Would you say that's correct? How does it sort of how does it
I think in terms of the social awareness facet, possibly. I think in terms of assertiveness, I think it's dangerous to assume that introverts are not assertive. I think it's where the motivation to be assertive comes from. So a strong character will assert through force of personality, but an introvert can be very assertive if they're on a subject matter that they have a lot of knowledge about or expertise in. So it just comes from a different place. And you know, if you get an introvert who's a specialist in a subject, they'll be pretty frank and pretty tough on that. But yeah, I think the social awareness bit, the bit about going to events where you don't know a single soul, the introvert is probably less likely to enjoy those than maybe the extrovert. Absolutely. Phil, you still there?
Yeah, I am. You can't see me for some reason, but I'm here. So shall we move on to because I think the thing about this is, as I said at the start, that don't try and focus on everything, but hopefully one or two things will resonate with you and think, yeah, that's me. And those are the things to think, okay, what can I do about that? And just to stress again that it's helpful being in the middle ground. It's like being on a squash court. If you play squash, it's trying to get in the center of the court and you command the court from the center of the court. And this is a bit like that. It's saying, okay, too much can be unhelpful, too little can be unhelpful. It can be good as well and useful in situations, but try and think of it that way, that it's helpful to command the middle ground. And it is situational, very situational. I think overall is work out where your emotions are managing you rather than the other way around. When your emotions get the better of you, and then figure out, okay, what can I do to manage them, self-manage those more. I think it's worth saying as well, you know, there are some people who are going to naturally score themselves low if they do this on a psychometric, who are hard on themselves, and that's probably a combination of low self-belief, lowish self-belief, and so on. So they'll consider themselves not so good. And there are some people that would regard themselves good in everything. Well, that doesn't actually make sense if you think about it. If you had very high emotional regulation and very high empathy, chances are at some point you're going to explode. you can't keep it all in. So I remember coming across a sales director who thought he was marvelous because he scored high on all of these things. And I said, I think you're deluded. You know, that's not realistic. It's not going to happen. So yeah.
Let's share that. We're going to give you share a story with you to show how these facets are linked and can be linked. And the gentleman that we'll talk about as a chat we can share, because we've written a paper about him and we have his permission. This guy called Guy Kruger, who was head coach of USA Archery. The story very quickly about Guy, two very things. Back just before the London 2012 Olympics, Guy got injured, which meant that he was off work for quite a long period of time, and it suddenly dawned on him, I think 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks into being away from work, that he actually hadn't heard from any of the archers, from any of his coaches, from any of his team. No one had reached out to him to see how he was doing. Then when he came back to work in the run-up to London 2012 Olympics, finance was such that USA Archery couldn't take all of the coaches to the Olympics with them. So they asked the athletes which coaches they should take to the Olympics with them, and Guy didn't get on the plane. He wasn't one of the ones that the athletes invited. So we worked with Guy some years ago, and it's quite interesting. So Guy, and I'm going to point you to two things here. One is self-control, and the other is emotionality. Guy had a really, really high level of self-control, which meant that it was all about being in control. It was all about planning. It was all about staying calm. But what came with that was a little bit aloof, a little bit cold, no sense of urgency, was intolerant of others who were noisy or gregarious or trying to have fun. So it was kind of a robotic type approach to things. His low supply of emotionality meant that he was missing all these emotional cues. He was emotionally distant to people. He was under-investing in people, very independent-minded. All of his decisions was completely objective. And he had unwittingly pushed his athletes away from him. Hadn't intended to do that. He pushed his athletes away from him. Now, Guy, and I think Phil talked about this earlier, one of the things that about emotional intelligence is it isn't permanent, okay? It is not permanent. You can, if you choose to, do something about some of these things. You can work on them. You can read stuff. You can get some training. Whatever the words are, you can do something about this. So Guy decided to work very hard on this high supply of self-control that he had and this very low supply of emotionality, to the point where 3 or 4 years later, he hadn't changed as a human being. He was still the same person, but if you met him, you wouldn't recognize him, because he decided to lower his self-control and to increase his emotionality to the point where there was a greater balance between the two. And Phil, I don't really comment on this story, but a different guy, isn't he? Different guy, literally a different guy.
Yeah, there was an academic paper we put together with a professor in the States about it. Yeah, I think it's a real case study for how you can not change, but adapt. And in his case, he made up his mind, look, I need to reach out to, I mean, it's simple, isn't it, really? I've pushed people away, I get that now. I need to reach out to people more. I need to find out more about the person, I need to engage with them. Not suddenly become high on it, desperately high, very high on emotionality and sociability, but just show that he cares, show some interest. And over time, he found it worked, and he found it rewarding, and it loosened him up, and actually made him a better leader, a much better leader. And essentially underneath it all, he's still the same person. He's just regulating himself and managing himself much, much better. Yeah.
That's so interesting, Phil. We had a question through just now. I think it's really relevant. Somebody said, get the impression it's hard to change who we naturally are. So to what extent can we improve elements of emotion? You've touched on that already a little bit, but they've said, I think quite accurately, that it seems to me the secret is more or less down to awareness.
Yes.
Yeah, you have to be focusing on your self-awareness, and I know Phil's a bit advocate of this, but seeking feedback from other people as well, seeking feedback from how you're coming across, the impact that you have. We don't do that enough as human beings. We don't talk to people about how do you feel about what happened there or what I did there, and you'd be amazed at the feedback that you get back. We sometimes, I'm old enough to remember the graphic equalizers and old stereos and hi-fis that we used to have, where you could turn up the bass and the treble and the tone and the volume, etc., etc. Phil and I believe that we all have our own set of dials which determine who we are and makes us authentic. It makes us us. But the really agile and flexible people are able to recognize that today I'm singing Juliet, so I need to turn the bass and the treble down today on that bit, or I need to turn the volume up tomorrow because I'm with Phil. It's recognizing that you can be you, but you need to turn the volume up and down a little bit to make sure that you have the impact that you want to have. And quite often, if you are confused by the reaction that you're getting from someone, it may be because they're just different on this facet scale to you, and they don't see the world like you see them. They have a different mountaintop view, as you would call it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. And something that came through again in pre-registered questions, Miles, touches on something you just touched on there in terms of helping yourself gain self-awareness in getting feedback from people. I'd love to know any tips both of you have on how you can do that, because I think one thing is that I don't know if it's a cultural thing as well. As British people, we're nervous to tell each other what we really think sometimes. Are there any good ways of getting sort of honest feedback from people? Because I'd imagine as well, if somebody is, for example, low on the sociability, or perhaps particularly high on emotionality, there might be various reasons why colleagues, friends might be a little bit reticent to give them honest feedback. Do you know what I mean? Have you got any tips on how you can get that from people?
I think I would start with reflecting. So think about yourself. Try and imagine how other people see you is a big help, because you'll probably know if you know what I mean before you ask them. I think to ask them, I do it as a sharing thing. Someone you trust, a friend, a colleague, someone you trust each other. Say, hey, it's just because one of the things we encourage people to do, coaches and athletes or managers and teams, is to say, okay, pair up, and I'm going to tell you now, if to get the best out of me, then maybe think about doing this, this, and this. If we're working together, if we're collaborating, And the things to avoid are this, this, and this. And then you swap over, the other person does the same thing. And it starts a conversation. You're actually giving feedback. You're sort of signaling to the other person the feedback you're looking for. And you generally would open it up. And we don't do enough of that, as Miles says, but there are simple ways of doing it. But you can work a lot of it out yourself. I think you just need a steer, and occasionally, if you ask or we get some feedback, even if you don't ask for it, it can be life-changing.
Yeah.
It can be life-changing.
Yeah.
So
I think the point you led, if you're uncomfortable with giving feedback, then Phil's point there about having that conversation, look, to get the best out of me, do these things, but to not get the best out of me, avoid doing this. So you kind of give feedback, but not in a direct way, and it's a great exercise. And we had I remember years ago, we were doing something with the head of USA skiing and snowboarding, and we did this exercise of this, how to get the best out of me, and this is what to avoid. And he said to Phil at the end of it, you know, that last half an hour of doing that with about 10 people, I've learned more about coaching in half an hour than I have in the last 3 or 4 years, because people just don't have conversations. They just don't have basic conversations. Yeah.
You see, Guy Kruger from archery, he got feedback, but it isn't the normal way you'd expect to get feedback. His colleagues not contacting him for several weeks. That's feedback. He wasn't chosen to go to 2012 games. That's feedback. So if you look, I think, you know, you can weigh it up a lot without a great deal of help in many cases from other people.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I've got a few questions here. Is it all right if I go through some each? So I mean, this is probably an extension of what we've just been talking about, but and this was a really common theme. Again, people asking, how can I improve my emotional intelligence? And I think you very clearly demonstrated that it's not as simple as that. It's multifaceted, and it might be a case of focusing in, having a think, reflecting, and thinking about the areas. But somebody's asked, you know, are there any sort of daily habits or habits that we can get into to help improve? Maybe it's one particular facet, but is there anything that you can think of that you know, in terms of new habits that we can adopt to help us work on these things?
Well, I think reflection is number one, because we're so busy and we don't have enough time, and we are very time poor. And I think to find a way of doing that that works for you. So I mean, we know one of our colleagues, David Faulkner, he used to do reflection logs every day building up to an Olympics and actually being there, and he would do it on camera, you know, so he'd film himself reflecting on the day and what's happened and how he reacted. I mean, that might be a bit too extreme for most people, but it certainly worked for him. And I think we can all find some way of whether it's writing it down, or which is good for some people because it makes them focus.
One of the things you can do is play a little movie in your head. So if you're on your way home in the car in the evening, just roll a little movie in your head of what's happened during that day, and just think about things that have gone well and things that maybe could have gone differently, and then think about why they could have gone differently. Why someone's reacted the way that they're reacting. I think that's quite powerful. And of course, if you're someone sat there thinking, oh, well, I've got really good emotional intelligence, I'm pretty good at this stuff, then I can guarantee you won't be aware of your shortcomings if you're thinking like that. So you need to think.
I just it's so interesting, and I think it makes me really think. I'm sure lots of people watching are thinking the same. That reflection piece is so important, and I think I personally think, I hope you agree, a good exercise to do is to think about you know, I think we all do it, and we can fall into the trap of doing it when somebody has a reaction that we don't understand. Say it's at work in a meeting and somebody displays, you know, it's one-on-one and they have a reaction to something that you think, that's strange. And I think the natural trap to fall into is to think, well, that was strange. I don't get why they do that. You know, they're not like me, you know, rather than reflecting on, well, hang on, what's going on for them, putting yourself in their shoes, and then also thinking about your part in that conversation and how it might have impacted that person. That's a really important piece of reflection, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's hold the mirror up to yourself, but also take a close look at the other person, because you're not a bad person if something's gone wrong. You know what I mean? It's just there's been a failure in the communication, and in this case, it's emotions that are contributing to that. Something's triggered emotions,
Yeah.
and it can be puzzling. But if you do reflect on it and think about it, I think you can figure it out. You know, you can work your way through it, or get a second opinion. You know,
Yeah.
if you're not
You
sure.
go and find someone that's very different to you, that's not like you at all. You know, Phil and I worked together for nearly the best part of 20 years now. We're very different people with different strengths, different limitations, different emotional intelligence levels and certain facets. But, you know, we learn from each other all the time, you know. Well, I do anyway, Phil, but yeah, all the time.
Likewise, yeah.
We're very, very different. So
there's another reason why diversity in a team is so helpful, isn't it? You know, good example there. So a really popular question that came in was around, I think this leads nicely onto this actually, was how can we help others become more aware of their emotions? So I think this might be coming from people who work with people or live with people that they perhaps think they'd like to give them a nudge after this webinar and encourage them to think about their emotional intelligence. But it's, what are your thoughts on that?
I think share some of what we've been talking about, but in a positive way, because stress, if someone needs to learn about, you think someone needs to learn about emotional intelligence, there's probably something triggering that, right? So there's something about them and the way they behave or the way they react. But please don't, it's not a blame thing, this. It's looking at human nature and recognizing that we're all different. We all react in different ways. There's stuff going on. So it's helping them understand. And yeah, it's a difficult conversation to start, quite possibly. But you might say, well, I've discovered some interesting things about emotional intelligence. Let's just talk about it, and then use yourself. I think showing some vulnerability in relation to yourself. If you're a boss, for example, I think it's really essential that you do that, because otherwise the employee starts to think, oh, the boss is onto me, the boss is not happy with me, so he's giving me feedback about me, and you create this parent-child type relationship, which is not helpful. But to make it adult to adult, as a boss, as a leader, I'd say share something about yourself before you launch into another person. Don't launch into them anyway, but use it as a constructive. What can we learn? What can we both learn?
I agree with that, Phil, and I think without sounding too controversial, don't always assume it's them, not you, as well. So think about that statement. Think about that statement, because it could be the way that you're behaving that's creating a reaction in them. I'm not suggesting that's the case, but it could be. But if you know that you've got someone in the house who is emotional regulation is difficult to control when they get really busy at work or stressed at work or something doesn't go well at work, then think about what they might need from you to help them with that. Don't criticize them for getting stressed and becoming vocal about it. Something is causing that in them, that reaction. So think about why that might be. And if you're not like them, then maybe give a perspective on how you would deal with it. We sometimes slip into that's the wrong way to behave, that's the right way to behave. It isn't as simple as that. It's just how we're drawn to behave in a certain way. We all react in a certain way. You know, we all know people who will have a conversation with them or will ask them a question and you just get nothing back. And that to the more emotionality people winds you up, because you think, come on, talk to me, tell me. And they're thinking about it. They're reflecting about it. Yeah. Just being aware that we're not the same. We're different people. But I do think, I mean, it's a two-way thing. It's a two-way contract, this emotional intelligence thing with partners. Absolutely.
Absolutely, and you're so right about that assumption. I think it speaks to something we've mentioned a few times, haven't we, today? But that, you know, to think that you're just good at all of this is dangerous, isn't it? Because it possibly shows that you might need to do a little bit more self-reflection, because none of us are perfect. And obviously also it's situational, isn't it? And changeable. And actually that's a question that that has come in a couple of times from a couple of people is, you know, here we go. Sorry, I'm just having a little read through. Oh, somebody's asked about nature versus nurture, and I think this speaks to that as well a little bit. But someone said, hey, how much of it comes from, you know, nature and how much is nurture? But I think we've spoken to this already, really, haven't we, in the sense that it can change. And I'm guessing somebody can take an EQ test and 1 year and then another year take it and it gets quite different results.
Yeah.
Aurelio, I
Oh,
think.
yeah, Guy Kruger is a good example of it. You know, he did change. So
Yeah.
he might have. It's part of nature, but I'm sure he was born with certain leanings towards certain behaviours, or he was certainly in his early life as a child, he would have been influenced by what's around him. It would have shaped him.
Yeah.
And he ended up where he was because, well, the sum total of experience brings me to this point. But
Yeah.
you can change, and that's because some people say, some experts say, oh, it's fixed, you can't change your emotional intelligence. I mean, Miles and I think that's complete rubbish. It really is.
Yeah.
I think that's a funny, when you look at the facets, and the first one that you mentioned was happiness, and that's something that's going to change, isn't it? That's going to be
Absolutely. And then the nature nurture thing is really interesting, because I think it's about adapting, not necessarily that. I have twin daughters, okay, who have been nurtured in exactly the same way, but they're completely human beings. Human beings. So it's all up for grabs in terms of, if you want to be more self-aware, if you want to have greater levels of that kind of self-awareness, you can choose to do something about it. You can choose to. You can also choose not to, of course. You can choose to do something about it.
The willingness is key, isn't it? It's just as important as the self-awareness piece. Excellent. So a great question that came in prior to the webinar, which I love, is can you think of any well-known leaders or public figures who you would say have high overall emotional intelligence?
Well, the one that springs to mind immediately is the Obamas. I think Barack Obama, Michelle, they just seem to have it. I mean, he will talk openly about his shortcomings and the fact that Michelle pulls him up on things. You know, how many leaders do that? You know, and he's able to engage with all sorts of different people. So I think something's happened to those two, which has brought them to this point where they're just so able to do that. I think they're really good at that.
They're very agile in their approach to things. Very agile. Yeah. So
I think as well, you'll see if you Google it, you'll find that Oprah Winfrey and Angelina Jolie come high up the ranks in terms of high emotional intelligence. I do know that Angelina Jolie, she's an ambassador, isn't she, for charities and things like that. And when she's on a field trip, she insists on staying in exactly the same place that everyone else in the team is staying at. She doesn't expect any star treatment.
Right.
I think that shows an understanding. I mean, it's just one example, but it shows an understanding that she knows the star thing is going to get in the way, and that's not going to happen as far as she's concerned. So yeah, there are some people out there. I think the Prince William and Kate, they seem to show they've certainly got empathy. They're certainly able to do that, and again, reach out to different people. So yeah.
Yeah, but actually it's hard, isn't it? It's hard to, those are some great examples, but obviously we don't know them, do we?
No.
You only know it's a sort of a PR job, a lot of it, isn't it? You imagine.
We used to have a very flippant answer, Juliet, when we used to say, "Are you emotionally intelligent?" and that answer was somewhat, which means sometimes.
It's a choice thing as well. I mean, you'll come across people, I'm sure, who don't care. They don't care whether they're emotionally intelligent or not. In fact, they've stopped learning. They don't have an open mindset, learning mindset, and they've decided that this is me. This is the way I am. Take it or leave it.
We're running out of time, but I have one last question, because leadership come up, and we did say we'd talk about this, and I think it's really, really interesting. And perhaps it plays into sort of workplace culture somewhat, but I think when you go through those traits of emotional intelligence, I think it's quite clear, isn't it, that really traditionally or historically certain traits were valued above others when it came to leadership. You know, that kind of my way and strong, and maybe less empathy would just celebrate something that was seen to work from a leadership point of view. But things have changed, haven't they, in terms of what we value and what we need.
They have, yeah. there's something called, Phil may have mentioned it last time we spoke with you guys, called the Athena Doctrine, which was a piece of research that was conducted about what are the most valued characteristics in leadership in the 21st century. And it's changed from being directive and directing and to things like show empathy, show vulnerability, which is an interesting one, show connectedness, which is the ability to connect your team and your people with each other. So I think leadership going forward will require a greater awareness of emotional intelligence than ever before, because do as I tell you mentality is becoming a little bit old-fashioned.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't watch probably well with any of us anymore, really, does it? But the millennial generation and the upcoming Gen Z,
yeah,
they want something different. Right. Well, I'm so sorry to say that we are out of time. So Miles, Phil, I can't thank you enough for this fascinating session. It really has been so eye-opening, and I hope everybody watching has enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for watching as well. Thank you for submitting your questions. I'm very aware that we didn't get through all of them. I'm so sorry we haven't had time. But as I mentioned before, in the handout section, you'll find the slide that we shared during the session. You'll also find all of our events for February. So please, if you enjoyed this, please do sign up for one or two of those. And in a couple of days, or I think it's within 24 hours, you'll get an email from us with a survey. We absolutely really do read every single one of your comments and suggestions, so please leave us some feedback. We would be thrilled to read it. And if you'd like to see more events like this, so you can ask more questions, please do let us know. So without further ado, I'll say goodbye and have a lovely weekend. Thank you for watching.
Thanks, Juliet.
Thank you. Bye.